Hi everyone, thanks for joining. I'm going to give it just 1 or 2 more minutes to let people log in here and then we'll get started. Okay, hi everyone and thanks for tuning in today. My name is Maggie Downing. I'm the manager of digital imaging at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. And today's webinar on quality control and in-house versus outsourcing digitization is the 5th in our Digitization 101 series of 6 episodes. Today's webinar and all of the webinars in this series are being recorded and will be available on YouTube. And a link will be sent to all registrants for today's webinar when it's been posted in the next day or 2. So I will try to answer a few questions at the end, and you're also welcome to email me with any follow-up questions you may have. So the images in today's slides are all from the Library of Congress, and they are posters created for the Works Progress Administration and Federal Arts Project during the 1930s. So this week's webinar is combining 2 separate but related discussions. In this series so far, we've talked about prioritization, file storage, file specifications, and metadata. So now it's time to start thinking about finally getting to work. So first we'll talk about the pros and cons of digitizing in-house using purchased equipment versus outsourcing your project to a digitization vendor. I'll talk about what to look for in a vendor and some information to include when you request estimates. And then next week, I'll talk about equipment selection for in-house digitization. So then I'll spend a few minutes to discuss quality control for image quality and metadata. It can be exciting once you get to this point of starting your project, but it's important to establish procedures in advance for quality control measures as you proceed through the project. So as you're deciding where to do the actual digitization, keep in mind that scanning accounts for just about 1/3 of the project time in a digitization project. The cataloging description, indexing, preparation of materials, and project management make up the other 2/3. But one cool thing about this is if you're applying for grant funding, this staff time can often count toward in-house fundraising match requirements, depending on the grant. First, let's take a look at the pros and cons of keeping your whole operation in-house. Purchasing equipment and digitizing your materials in-house has a lot of advantages, and I think the key advantage here is the level of control you have over your project and timeline. When you're working with your own equipment and staffing, you can work on a more flexible timeline, work at your own pace, and sort out any questions and issues as they arise. For example, if your imaging technician is familiar with the collection, she may be able to sort out any cataloging or file naming discrepancies as she goes along, which is something that might cause delays if you outsource it to a vendor who would be unfamiliar with your collection. Working in-house can also be beneficial if you want to work a little bit at a time. And digitizing in-house means you don't have to worry about any security issues related to packing and transporting your materials to a new location. Although there will always be some level of transportation depending on where your studio is set up. So this risk is never like 100% eliminated when starting a digitization project. But once your studio is all set up and your staff is trained, you'll have new staff skills, which is always a plus. And you can pretty much establish an ongoing digitization operation. which obviously is easier said than done because people doing the digitization and quality control do still need to be paid. So of course, there are also some drawbacks. Depending on the type of and amount of materials you'll be scanning, setting up an in-house operation may require a lot of resources, including time and money on equipment purchase, staff training, and the staff time for the digitization. It's also important to point out that equipment purchase is not a one-time expense. You'll also be responsible for maintaining and repairing the equipment as needed, and should plan to budget for replacing the equipment and upgrading software every 5 to 7 years or so, depending on technological changes. Your own staff will need to be responsible for all image quality control checks, and you'll also need to find a space to do this, which again, depending on the project, could be a full studio set up in a room, or just a desk with a flatbed scanner. Newly trained staff may have limited technical expertise compared with a digitization vendor, but that can be avoided if you're planning to hire new staffing for the project, because you can always seek out candidates with experience. So this isn't necessarily an issue, but I did want to mention this here. Digitizing in-house would make a lot of sense if you have a very homogeneous collection that you want to digitize, such as a collection of correspondence that can all be done on a flatbed scanner, which is relatively inexpensive. Or on the flip side, if you have a very large and varied collection that contains a lot of different types of materials, such as books, oversized materials, and objects, then setting up an in-house studio would make sense, especially if you have a growing collection that you want to digitize in an ongoing manner. The other option available is to outsource the digitization and let someone else take care of it. The benefits to outsourcing are that a professional digitization vendor will have dedicated staff and workstations, so production can often move much faster than working in-house. By outsourcing the digitization, you don't require much in-house technical expertise in digitization, which reduces the need for staff training or extra hiring. And a vendor will be able to provide high production levels and will also provide image quality control checks, saving even more staff time there. And lastly, of course, you don't have to pay for the equipment or training, just the scanning. However, there is certainly less flexibility when working with a vendor, and you have to have a clearly defined project scope and make sure all of your file specifications decisions are made ahead of time. Working with a vendor requires very clear communication. And lastly, there is, of course, always a risk to originals whenever you'll be packing and transporting them. This risk can be reduced with proper packing and shipping methods, which your vendor should be able to guide you on or provide on-site packing services. Also, some vendors will provide an option for digitizing on-site, which eliminates the need to pack and ship, but you would still need to have the whole project ready to go when they arrive. This option is usually also more expensive, but good to keep in mind. If you think that outsourcing might be right for you, here are some of the things to look for in a vendor. A vendor should be able to demonstrate that they have written image quality control procedures in place, staff expertise in handling fragile materials, conservators on staff if needed. So if you have some materials that need to have conservation treatment as part of your project, then a one-stop shop like the Conservation Center would be a good option, because this way it can be done all in one place. Another advantage to digitizing at a conservation center is that you can do the imaging mid-treatment, like when a book is unbound or will be rebound, or while a piece is unmatted or framed or unframed. The vendor should be able to provide references and sample projects that are similar in scope to your project, so that you know there won't be a high learning curve that you'll end up paying for. And a vendor should also demonstrate that they have proper security and safety measures in place to protect artwork. This includes a secure, fire-resistant, climate-controlled storage space available only by personnel, a climate-controlled lab and digitization studio spaces, and not allow smoking, eating, or drinking in areas where documents will be handled. To request estimates from a vendor, some important information to include about your project is your anticipated project timeline, whether the imaging can be done at the vendor's facilities or do you need the imaging done on site at your facilities, the number and size of the originals. So think about the approximate number of pages or images that you want to capture, and think about whether you want to capture the recto and verso of all of your materials. Provide information about the type of materials. So are they bound? Are they flat? Are there a mix? Any condition issues or special handling notes? So will the materials need to be removed from any housing or envelopes or encapsulation prior to capture? And are there any fasteners such as paper clips or staples that will need to be removed by the vendor? You want to provide file naming, cropping, resolution, bit depth, color, all of these file specifications that we discussed in webinar 3. And also metadata requirements. So do you need the vendor to embed anything besides technical metadata, which again is embedded automatically and includes the date created, the equipment that was used, pixel dimensions, things like that. And also, if you want the vendor to include packing and transportation costs, just mention that right in your RFP. So a vendor will likely have follow-up questions, and depending on the size of your project, may propose a site visit to review the materials in advance. So be sure to buffer in a little time into your requests for quotes. And again, if you think that digitizing in-house is the right thing for your institution, we'll discuss equipment and software selection next week. But for now, I want to take a minute and talk about quality control. So quality control or quality assurance are the processes used to ensure that digitization and metadata creation are done properly. They should address specific issues, accuracy requirements, and acceptable error rates for all aspects that are evaluated. And a quality control program should address what elements you're looking at when reviewing materials, what percentage of files you'll review, what causes a file to fail quality control, and what procedures are in place for that. And I recommend looking at the NARA technical guidelines from the National Archives for digitizing archival materials, because they have a whole section on quality control, and that can be used as a model. And CCAHA's own quality control checklists are based on the NARA guidelines, and that link is now there in the chat. So at CCAHA, for large-scale projects, we usually perform a visual inspection of 100% of raw files before they're processed. And during this initial inspection, I'm checking for correct file names, orientation, distortion, scale reference, or color chart if that has been requested by the client, correct cropping, background color, even tonal values and contrast, and completeness, meaning that all of the captures are accounted for and no pages were skipped, along with any extra specifications that the client may have provided. On the slide here is a sample form where I will note the requirements for each criteria, an area for correction notes, and a place to sign off on. Then once the files are processed, I'll perform a final check of 10% of the files. So I'll open the files up in Photoshop and check for correct file format, compression, color mode, bit depth, dimensions, resolution, metadata as needed by the client, and artifacts. And this could be physical artifacts like dust, or digital artifacts like weird pixels or Newtonian rings, which can occur mostly in negative scanning. And I'm also looking at focus and overall image quality. So based on that 10% sampling, if I find that more than 1% of the total images that I've looked at are defective for any reason, then I will re-inspect the entire batch. And then any specific errors found in the 10% sampling, along with any additional errors found if I need to reinspect the entire batch, will be corrected. So for metadata, quality control is less defined in its evaluation metrics. An imaging vendor can evaluate that the requested metadata is embedded, but can't usually evaluate the quality of the metadata entry, which will likely need to be done with your own staff as experts on the material in your collections. That said, some vendors do provide cataloging services as well and can create basic descriptive metadata. Quality control for metadata will mostly need to be done by your own collection staff, and you'll want to evaluate the adherence to standards set by your institutional policy. So this is where your data dictionary that we discussed last week will become very useful. You'll want to check for the relevancy and accuracy of the metadata, the consistency in the creation of the metadata, checking that entered values are not ambiguous, the consistency and completeness in the level at which metadata is applied, whether that's at the file level, series level, or collection level. Just make sure that it's adhering to the standards that you create. And that the different types of metadata are represented. So check that there is sufficient descriptive metadata, technical and administrative metadata. That's all been provided, and that all mandatory fields are complete. So even though quality control for metadata is less defined in its metrics than image quality, you can use a similar sampling rate approach, examining a sampling of 10% of the files with a 1% threshold for failure before the whole batch needs to be re-examined. And again, these recommendations are all based on the NARA technical guidelines for digitizing archival materials. So definitely check that out as you are crafting your quality control plan. So again, we've talked in this series about prioritization, digital storage, file specifications, and metadata. So the exciting next steps are to decide whether you want to digitize in-house or outsource to a vendor by weighing the pros and cons as they relate to your collection. Draft written quality control procedures. And if you think you'll outsource to a vendor, you still need to draft metadata quality control procedures. And start requesting estimates from vendors or planning for equipment purchase. So we talked about what to look for in a vendor, and next week we'll look at considerations in equipment and software purchases, as well as calibration targets. So with that, I'll wrap up and take a few minutes to look for some questions. And just mention that the last episode in the Digitization 101 series will be next week. Same time, same place, and we'll be discussing equipment selection. So let's take a look. I have a few minutes to answer some questions. So I have one, does quality control also include condition recording for the original material or only the resulting digitization? In this instance, I'm just talking about the digital files that result from the reformatting. But you would, I mean, as you go through the materials, it's a great opportunity to record condition information into your collections management system or whatever database you're using. It's a great opportunity to look at that too. Can we add the link to the previous recordings? Leah, do you have access to that? If not, we can add that into the link that goes out to everybody. This question from Sally, is liability insurance included in vendor contracts? A lot of times, yes, and I do recommend mentioning whether you want the vendor to provide insurance. Some vendors will charge for insurance coverage, others will not. But you could also look at your own insurance policies to see if it covers your materials while off-site, because that's another option to look at too. We have a question, what's the standard for info included in metadata? That we talked a lot more about last week. different standards for metadata. And it's just really important to have local policies in place. So we can send a link to that too. And Virginia, I can follow up with you via email if you'd like. No problem. Okay, everybody. Thanks so much. And looking forward to wrapping up the series with you next week.